Today we're going to be talking about living well at every stage of life. And as you can see from this graphic, there are risk factors that differ across each stage of life, whether that be stressful life events, which are interestingly sort of bookend between sort of early life and late life, depression or anxiety disorders, which actually might occur at different stages in life, health issues might differ at different stages of life, and at each stage of life there's also a protective factor that will help you avoid having any of these sort of risk factors impede some of the development of well-being in your life. We'll start by talking about resilience, specifically resilience in childhood. If you're a resilience researcher, you'd really be interested in the naturally occurring resources that help children and adolescents overcome many of life's challenges. Those resources might obviously be personal or environmental, but sort of looking at sort of how do individuals who are really in situations where they might be experiencing a lot of adversity still continue to thrive. That's the research side. On the applied side, you'll see the book devote a lot of time to positive youth developmentalist programs, which really try and sort of nudge well-being or sort of nudge development by ensuring that the programs sort of capitalize on the assets that children have and the different types of environmental resources that again ultimately help students be resilient and thrive under even the most adverse circumstances. So what is resilience? Well, really there's two things that are very important about resilience. It is hard to be resilient if there's no adversity that you're experiencing. Sometimes you hear people talk about who have experienced major trauma. They didn't know how resilient they actually were or how resilient they could actually be until the adversity actually occurred. So they have to actually be experiencing some sort of adversity or at least be at risk of that, especially in early childhood. And then really the most parsimonious definition of resilience would be that you're bouncing back to sort of previous levels of sort of academic achievement or family functioning or psychological or mental well-being. So you have to experience adversity and then bounce back to a certain level. We will mostly infer that a person is resilient if they're sort of doing good or doing okay, so to speak, when there have been really, again, extenuating circumstances that pose a threat to some sort of good outcome. Again, most of those outcomes tend to be academic or emotional or vocational. And so if you're really looking at a child who has either experienced adversity or is at risk of adversity, part of what you're going to be looking at once the sort of threat has occurred and looking at their sort of post-threat functioning is have they and how long does it take for them to return to at least normal functioning. Though some researchers will actually focus on looking at evidence of excellence or sort of even going beyond normal functioning levels. There are really two different types of approaches to resilience research. One of those is to identify people who are sort of functioning well or sort of they're thriving. I think thriving is a really great generic term to use for situations in which you're sort of at your optimal best and you're functioning or thriving despite you've actually experienced a recent stressor. And you can contrast that with the characteristics of individuals who have sort of failed to bounce back. So, for example, there's a lot of research that occurs on the grieving process, and widowhood, and obviously later life in this situation. And of course, while everyone grieves, some people find a way, even in spite of the sort of traumatic loss of a life partner, to bounce back and to even maybe sometimes function well or thrive despite experiencing this great loss. Whereas there are some individuals who fail to sort of ever reach where they were before they experienced their loss. And so one type of paradigm is to actually look at the differences in these two sets of individuals. The other style of research is to really look at and this is much more for examining resilience in childhood, is to really look at individuals who are at risk of experiencing a stressor basically due to their life circumstances, and then identify how certain types of what we might call the sort of building blocks of resilience, effective problem solving, self-regulation, having a positive attitude, having a positive outlook, how these building blocks might actually prevent you from actually ever experiencing a negative outcome. And that second style of identifying individuals, specifically children who are at risk, and then determining how many of them actually develop problems, and how many of those who develop problems absolutely bounce back, was a style that was used in the early 70s by Amy Warner and Smith, when they actually studied 700 different children who were born on Kauai. And so what they did is they basically established what they considered the characteristics of a life that would be characterized children who would be at risk for some sort of academic or social problem. Those risk factors might be things like living in poverty, or having a parent who's an alcoholic, or experiencing a lot of domestic violence. Of the 700 children that were in their study, they found that 1/3 of them actually were considered at risk. So again, not all individuals, not all children have situations where they're at risk based on their demographic characteristics of actually having social or academic problems. Not that those children don't also sometimes have social academic problems. But if you're studying resilience, you have to start, in this case, with a high-risk population. What is interesting was, of that 1/3 who are actually at risk, 1/3 of them were resilient. In other words, they never developed any sort of significant life problem, either at least in childhood or adolescence. That was as far as they sort of tracked them. Whereas 2/3 of those who were at risk actually did develop some sort of significant life problem at some point. What they found was the difference between those who actually experienced some sort of negative life event in the sort of academic or social arena was that those children who were resilient had some pretty particular characteristics of themselves. They were typically very outgoing, and they were able to engage several sources of support. And what Warner and her colleague actually suggest here is that there's something particular about the ability to sort of ask for help when life is not going well. And so there's something about an outgoing disposition where some of these children might actually, if they didn't have good social systems, might actually recruit adults into their social system so that they actually would experience the type of support that they needed in that situation. Now, fortunately, most of the students, by the time the study had actually ended, 80% of them had, quote, bounced back to their original levels of academic and social functioning. So even though there are often setbacks for children who are at high risk, most of them eventually come back. And by far, and this is something the book talks about extensively, this is something that we see throughout all the research, one of the most important and really few universal truths in the resilience research is that one caring adult can help a youth or child adapt or bounce back to their previous levels. Again, in the positive youth development area, what we really see are trying to take that research about what it is to be a resilient child and sort of combine the qualities of youth. What is it about individuals or children who are resilient? They have high self-efficacy, high self-control and adaptability, and then try and actually develop or sort of advocate for the right sort of environmental resources. Try and sort of ensure that there's positive agents in these children's lives, and also always considering the context of a particular program. And so what we see here are this sort of simple arithmetic where you take the qualities of the youth, you advocate for the right sort of environmental resources, you put the right children's with the right sort of positive agents, and you consider the cultural context, and that's really how you're going to promote healthy development. This is where we'll end for the first part of the lecture today.